Mr. Rainwater,
Yeah, Joe.
I have a statement that I'm going to make, and then I want your thoughts.
Okay.
Texture is a luxury of rich people.
Interesting. When you say texture, you mean like textile kind of texture?
No, 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 no. Like,
How do you mean?
the better something feels in your hand.
Okay. So like
Or,
give me
okay, so the way I'm looking at this is, I'm a filmmaker, and
Okay.
if it were up to me, I would shoot on film all the time. I would not be shooting on video, which is clean. But the rich people and the snobby hipsters who want to act like they're, malnourished and stuff like that, actually have nice giant trust funds, shoot
Sure.
on film all the time and have this wonderful texture. I am stuck shooting on video most of the time. You, as a hand artist, kind of, to be economical, need to do it digitally in order
Sure.
to, and I'm not saying that's cheap, but it's cheaper than constantly going out and buying paper and pens and colors and refilling that particular thing. It's a one-time cost that usually lasts you a long time, but the texture that real paper, canvas, things of that nature supply does give a lot to your art. But
That's an interesting thing that you're saying, because what you're kind of implying is that like physicality, basically, like having physical objects is a luxury, right? Because
Sure.
nowadays everything that takes place digitally is so cheap. Sometimes it's free,
right.
which is hard to beat, right?
There's nothing better than free.
That that's where all of the beginners go to, or that's where all of the people who don't have the money to like buy a giant thing of like film canisters, right? Like I know who I think it's you would know this. Nolan likes to shoot most of his movies on film.
It's
right?
He's only shot on film. I don't believe he's ever shot a film digitally ever.
Oh, okay.
Not even like his indie. I just started making movies. I'm pretty sure it was shot on film as well.
That is like I don't know, in terms of analogy, it's almost like the farm-raised cow or chickens, right? Like the cage-free chickens, the cage-free eggs.
Yep.
That are more expensive in this analogy between cooking and like other art forms, right?
Well, let's just point out the fact that you are the one that raised the cooking analogy for once.
It's the best one I had. In this analogy, basically, like everything that you can touch and feel, right? Just it costs more money. So yeah, I would say I agree with what you're saying for the most part. There are interesting. I don't know. I would say there are interesting areas where that isn't necessarily the case.
Okay.
Certain forms of printing comics or printing like magazines can be a lot cheaper than like having to buy internet space. I'm like, what do you call this? Web space, right?
Sure, hard drive data, or like there's got to be a server somewhere that hosts it. So yeah.
Sometimes, surprisingly, it can be cheaper, especially if you're doing all the printing yourself. There are definitely a lot of people who do print what are called mini comics, which is another way of just saying, like
indie comics.
Yes, basically. And oftentimes they are printed in a smaller size, but that isn't always the case. Point being, like, sometimes it is cheaper to do it that way if you want to get it into people's hands. And certainly people love the physicality aspect of it because that is an additional, sensory thing.
That's what that's what I was going to ask you about, which, I mean, obviously from the title of this episode, we're talking about texture today, and how it applies to art. So I was going to ask you, what do you think is the draw to texture? Because you know what I mean? Like, every artist, it's not a subject that gets talked about a lot, but it seems to be like forefront with everybody when they talk about, like, a filmmaker. Like, they talk, oh, why do you want film? Well, the colors and the grain, you know, like, immediately they start describing texture. So I'm curious to know from you, what do you think is the big draw about texture? That A, why does everybody want it? And B, why don't people notice that they want it? You know what I mean? Like, it's a weird, hypocritical topic.
It's weird because it's also, I feel like it's dependent on the medium too. Like, I don't really fully understand why. I mean, because I do prefer watching movies that do have, like, you know, that have grain, that have that film quality.
Yep.
I think, like, and we've talked about this before, but I enjoy a lot of older, like, 70s movies because a lot of them are shot in a way where there is, like, the color palette is warmer. It's just easier on the eyes.
Yeah.
Like, I definitely sometimes have issues with a lot of the, like, digitally shot movies where a lot of times the digitally shot movies, like, the coloration in, like, I don't know, the way it's done is just, like, it's too sharp. I don't know if that makes sense. Like,
it's perfect.
Yeah, exactly. I think that hits on it exactly, because it's like, it's the same thing that makes auto-tuning like a hit or a miss for people. Like, auto-tuning, if done properly, is great, but if you do it improperly, it's like, what are you doing here? Like, this, I don't want to hear robot voices for every single, you know, song or whatever, right? Works great for Daft Punk, but it's not going to work great for a country song most of the time.
No.
And so, I don't know.
I would argue that it pulls the texture out of somebody's voice.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I'm not that big of a fan of auto-tuning. There's definitely somebody who I've recently kind of gotten into watching on YouTube, this guy named Rick Beato. He does a lot of stuff he's worked as a music producer. He's an accomplished musician in all sorts of other ways, but he has a pretty full thing going into, like, okay, here's what you can use auto-tuning for, and here's what you don't use auto-tuning for. And it's really interesting to watch because, like, I don't necessarily make music, but I'd like to learn, like, what are those from a producer standpoint, like, what goes into making those choices, right? Because originally, like, the idea behind auto-tuning was the idea that you could augment people's pitch to be closer to perfect if you had somebody who was just never, or I say pitch, key, whatever. I'm not good at musical terms.
Me neither, so I can't even correct you.
So if you needed to adjust them to be just so, you could do that as a producer, right? The problem is it took off to become this thing that all producers did all the time now, because it's like this
it's a cheat code.
It's not just the cheat code. I was going to say, you know, like, there are things where there's, like, somebody uses a trick in a film and then other people adopt that into their films, or like how for a long time all trailers after Inception had the Inception horn.
The burn.
Like,
yeah. I'm guilty of that too. I think they still do it, to be honest with you.
I've only recently noticed in, like, the last couple of years that, like, the Inception horn has been slowly replaced with, like, actual music, like, in the trailers. But that's getting a little off topic, I guess. I guess getting back to what you were talking about, right? In terms of texture. Sorry. Is everything all right over there?
Yeah, I dropped a roll of tape that I was just kind of meandering about with on my desk.
But I think part of it, and this is why I was talking about film being sort of odd in this, is that a lot of times the logic behind why texture is important is that it adds an additional immersive quality. And so with film, that isn't necessarily the case. It's actually, like, technically less immersive, because it's not how you I mean, it's not how I personally perceive the world from my eyes.
Yeah, I don't see
right?
grain right now. Like, I'm trying to focus on things in front of me. It's pretty damn clear.
Yeah, like technically digital film, right, would be closer to like eyesight, right?
Yeah.
And there's some, I think there's some aspect to film grain that, like I said, I think it might be that it actually makes the experience less immersive to a certain degree. Like there's a remove so that it's easier for you to get into what's going on, if that makes sense. Like if you got too into it too quick, it can actually be off-putting in the sense that I'm not ready to get this, into whatever's going on with Spider-Man or whatever.
It's literally Inception, where you wouldn't know the line between reality and fiction. You know what I mean? That's in front of you, and that's why they have the totem. So it's kind of like the grain on film is the totem. Oddly enough, that we're talking about Inception, but it's you know what I mean? Like it's I don't want to call it a barrier, but it's 100% like a shield, I guess you could say, for your psychological mindset.
Yeah, exactly. I have this theory that like virtual reality has not been adopted super quickly because of that issue, because it's too real for people.
We're not ready for it.
No. I mean,
it's true.
I think that's the case because if you were in that situation where like you no longer can properly distinguish between what is real and what is fake, like that is, and I've had situations like that in my life, and it's not fun. You know what I mean? Like it's not a fun place to be unless you have the proper mindset for it, and maybe a guide on that drug or something. Yeah. So that's film, and that's like, and I don't have a proper category for this maybe group to put, film, video games, television, those kind of narrative type art forms into, to say like, okay, for those in particular, there's only so far you can go in terms of how much texture, right, you add, basically, at least right now. I mean, I don't know, like, have you ever gone to Disney World and done like the Honey I Shrunk the Kids like 3D spectacular thing?
No.
Where it's okay.
Is that are you talking about California or Florida?
Florida.
I went to Florida once in my entire life. The only thing that I came close to what you're describing is something called Soarin', which I absolutely loved.
Okay, I haven't heard of that.
Soarin' was like an immersive, I don't want to call it a roller coaster, but it was kind of like a one of those things that you sit on and the floor drops out from beneath you, or like you rise up. I don't really remember. But what it was like a giant IMAX screen in front of me that like encompassed my whole field of vision.
Yeah.
And then they used like blowers that I couldn't see to blow air at me that not only was that differed in temperature, but also differed in smell. And you literally fly across like the Amazon, and then like within a minute you're over the Arctic, and then you're over the Sahara, and you know what I mean? Like it literally was just like changing temperature, changing the speed of the wind, the smell of the wind, like the whole 9 yards. And that's about as close as to what you just described that I've gotten. I didn't even know there was a Honey I Shrunk the Kids ride.
This was years ago. I mean, this was like,
maybe it's Soarin' now.
Yeah, I think so. Because this was when I was in middle school. So I mean, this was a long time ago. But yeah, pretty much exactly what you were describing, right? Where it's like, I mean, it freaks out everybody in the theater because it's like too much after a while. And fortunately, it ends, because if it didn't end, then
you lose your mind.
Exactly. So I guess I could say like we'll group that bunch of art forms right there, and go to another one where it's like sculpture. Sculpture is something where technically most sculpture pieces you shouldn't touch unless you buy it yourself, right? But part of the allure of something like sculpture is that you can touch it. It's something that you can feel
physically, not if you ask the museum.
Yeah, exactly. But let's say that you bought like a bronze, right? Like what the hell is his name? I think it was Degas. I could be getting this totally wrong. Um, turn of the century artist. He had done a lot of bronzes that a number of people have, and I've had one of them at least at some point that I got from my grandparents. But what's really interesting is like, I think this was Degas, but I'm not sure. Anyway, you can like see, because these are made very quickly, and I'm not sure of the process that he did the bronzing in, but I'm going to assume that he probably started from a clay sculpture and then made a mold and then bronzed from that mold. But you can see like the imprints of his fingers like in the in the sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see it's sort of in the same way that you can see like brushstrokes in a painting. To me, that kind of texture, I love that because I can kind of see little bits and I can glean little bits and pieces of the process. And me being an art junkie, I'd love to see that. I'd love to think about it. And it also kind of inspires me in a way where it's like, oh, what would it feel like for me to do that? To me to make something like that.
You literally get to leave an imprint on there. It's not, we talked about this sometimes before about like when we were talking about, cheating in art or whatever, where you just punch in a number into Photoshop and it does the adjustment for you and anyone can do that. I mean, you have to be smart enough to create the random jumble of numbers and settings and so on and so forth to come up with something. But at the end of the day, the computer ends up doing the work. Like you give the command, the computer does the work. Whereas what you're talking about, not only are you giving your hand the command, but you are doing the work, but with the brush stroke or molding the clay or whatnot. So it's a little touch of personality, and it goes back to what you talked about. I think way back on our first podcast about an artist's signature and their style and all that kind of stuff being important. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's it connects the audience with the artist. Even if you weren't an art junkie, you feel a little bit closer because it's like, well, I mean, it's like you look at some stuff. I can get a replica movie prop, right? Or costumes or whatever like that. I can find the shirt or whatever, and it's cool. And I've got, oh, this is the shirt that, Randy wore in Scream or some shit like that. And, oh, it's cool. But if I have the actual set production shirt that Randy wore in Scream, it's so much more. But why? Because you're a little bit closer to the artist that made the movie. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have his BO on it anymore, I don't think, after so many years. But
that would be another form of texture, though.
But he touched
right?
it. You know what I mean? Like, it touched him. So now, like, by owning that shirt, I'm closer to the movie. And that means all the more to me. So I think that's what you're really kind of getting at, right? Is that the texture is the imprint of the artist. No?
Yes. I think so. I mean, I like where you're going with that because there's another form of texture that, and I think this was something I thought about when we first discussed this subject, which was something that I really related to when you brought the subject up was there's a whole genre of like music streams on YouTube that are based almost entirely on the texture of them. So like vaporwave, lo-fi chill, like lo-fi stations in general. That's lo-fi is entirely a texture, right? It's the idea that you're listening to something either through like an AM station or like through a tape cassette. But the idea is that the quality of the music you're listening to is actually a lower grade quality, and for some reason that adds this texture to it that gives it more of a like an authenticity or whatever.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I've noticed become kind of popular in a lot of music that, people are inspired from all that, and they're implementing it into songs more intentionally. And I'm not really like, it's something that really interests me because I can't quite place why I find it appealing, like why I find that sound appealing, or like why I like listening to like Japanese city pop, which is like the 80s type pop from Japan. I think it just has to do. I think it's largely nostalgia, on some level, and the sound of like listening to something either through like a record, right, through Vellum, or not Vellum, vinyl. That adds like an extra step in that nostalgia. Like, this is another interesting thing that I heard recently on an interview. This is going back to Rick Beato. He did an interview with Brian May from Queen, and Brian May was making a comment about, he was really fascinated to find out that in the UK, records are outstripping CDs because people want that texture that comes from the record. And the way he was describing it too, there's an additional experience of like, you pull out a record, you also have the album cover, right? The album cover itself is like another part of the art experience.
Right.
You can hang it up on the wall, or you also get like, a big thing of like liner notes and stuff that you can read through while you're listening to the music. It's an entire
experience.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Right. It's an entire experience, as opposed to like, just listening to Queen on Spotify, where it's just like, oh yeah, it's Queen, and then you move on with your day.
Yeah, you find out the next thing on the mix.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I don't think I had anything of use to say. You should go forward.
I was gonna say, when you were talking about that kind of lesser quality type thing, I don't want to call it an error, right? It's not, but it goes back to the whole the topic of something being perfect, not being appealing. I was going to ask you, do you watch professional wrestling?
Every once in a while, but I'm curious where you're going with this.
When you watch, do you watch it live, or do you watch the...
I've never watched it live.
Not like in-person experience live. Just like live airing on TV, or do you just watch like a rerun or something like that, like an old show or something?
It's usually reruns.
Okay.
Yeah.
I... occasionally, I watch professional wrestling. Don't get me wrong. I do not watch professional wrestling when it's been pre-taped. Now I'm talking about something that has not aired yet, but has already happened.
Yeah.
When it happens live, I'm almost 99.99% watching, and that's simply because there's room for error, and there's something exciting about that.
Because you don't know what's going to happen.
You don't know what's going to happen, right? And I mean, if it's pre-taped, I can Google it, and there's 20 dirt sheets that already have it. But the point is, it's not necessarily like, oh, somebody broke their neck, or somebody jumped the barricade, or some shit like that. But literally, the element of error and surprise adds that excitement to it. So, to me, when you listen to something that's perfect, that's got smooth, vocals, and it's got the echo and the reverb and all that studio fanfare and all that kind of jazz, yes, it can be enjoyable, but there's something about that room for error that comes on when you hear like a live performance. Even if it's like a concert CD, it's got that, it makes you pay a little bit more attention to it, right? And that it goes back to the idea of something being imperfect. Because even in a live concert, they're not hitting the chords exactly the way they should all the time. They're sweating, they're tired, the weather, maybe the fans, maybe they've had a couple of drinks. Like there's a whole lot of variables that go into it, and that changes the texture of their singing, how fast they're playing their instruments, how hard they're playing their instruments, if their instruments are plugged in all the way. Like there's all kinds of variables that kind of into it that make it imperfect. And that adds texture to it. And I think that texture is what everybody kind of goes for. I mean, I don't know. I want to say that, like, texture is imperfection. You know what I mean? Like, because it kind of is. It's a spontaneity. When you look at texture, it's very soothing if something is perfectly textured, where you could just, like, braille. Like, if you know what I mean? Like, if it's just perfect. But if it's imperfect, that, like, you feel it more. Does that make sense? And that's because you're, again, you like rub your hand over it a little bit more because you're looking not necessarily for the error, but for the thing that's different, the thing that's unique.
Yeah.
And
No, I definitely get what you're saying
it
there.
adds the chaos and from the uniformity of perfection. I don't know. I think that's just me kind of spilling brain in a random train of thought right there. But I feel like texture and perfection are somehow linked to one another, and that's really what it comes down to, right?
I think so. What that got me thinking about, certainly when you think about like wood, right? Like something that is hand carved versus something that's like machine carved. Like let's say, I don't know, you get like a bed frame, right?
Sure.
And you get a bed frame like somebody made by hand versus like an IKEA bed frame.
Mm.
Both could be made out of wood, but the IKEA one's it's not gonna feel like anything because it's been machine carved. It's been
everybody else has it.
Yeah, and intentionally made to be like exactly like you were just saying, the same thing throughout, right?
Yeah.
And it's certainly a part of the reason why I like listening to radio a lot. I do listen to a fair amount of radio during the day when I work. And part of the reason I like that is if I find a good station, especially like a freeform station, it's because you have like lineups of DJs who come on. Each DJ has their own particular like eccentricities, interests. Their show is tailored towards those interests, and you get to learn about them every time they come on, right? You learn about them a little bit. It's live, so like it feels very intimate, like you're there with them.
Yep.
Even though it's kind of a one-way conversation, but there's this term that's come about recently that I kind of relate to, that's parasocial, right? It's the idea that it's not really a social relationship in the sense that they don't know who the fuck you are, but you know everything about them, right?
Yep,
or you know as much as they're willing to give away.
Celebrity, yeah.
Yeah, and that's certainly part of the experience of radio that I really appreciate, and the experience with a lot of streaming. Like streaming is also very radio-like in this way. And I think, venues like Twitch or YouTube streams have become very popular because of that same sort of, or even more so because people can now like chat, right? They can talk back and forth with the people who they're interested with. And that is like a whole other realm of immersiveness that wasn't available in radio, basically.
Yeah. When you say you listen to the radio, you listen to like AM, FM, or are you talking about online?
I'm listening to it online, but the stations I'm listening to are generally like FM stations.
Oh, okay. So it's just they're picking up the stream of whatever it is that they're doing. Okay. Because like when I listen to a station, it's basically a playlist. Like they call it a station, but they just hide the playlist from me, and it's just the songs.
And I've listened to stations like that, but yeah, it can be like there's not a lot to it.
Yeah, it's a very sterile experience. Like, and most of the time they play the same songs. It's just like the real fucking radio, but it really is. There is, but you know what I mean. Like that's the beauty of like an AM FM station is that. Yes, they have their playlist that their overseers give them and say, okay, we got to play Stairway to Heaven 6 times this week and da-da-da-da-da. But every once in a while, the DJ will interject a song that they love that you may never have heard. And, and it's just one of those things that's when you get lifted, right? Isn't that like the difference that when it's in the grain of the playlist, that song breaks the texture, and that's when it becomes imperfect, because it's like, oh, I've listened to these fucking same songs, every week they play these same songs because it's a 70s station or whatever like that. But all of a sudden a DJ comes along and says, hey, this is one of my favorite songs from the 70s and we don't ever play it, but I'm going to play it right now. Boom. It blows your mind. Like that's the beauty of that kind of texture, of changing, the pattern. Right? Because that's another thing that's important in texture is patterns.
I would say it's almost like, because a lot of the things that we think of as like natural textures, they are patterns. They're just like patterns nature kind of devised over time, over however million years of evolution or whatever. Like think about the texture of like a leaf, right? That texture is like all the like veins that carry I don't know what it is, the fucking juice, that they use to like transport solar energy and do photosynthesis and all that stuff. But for us, it's just like, oh, that feels nice. Like I have a tendency when I go on walks to like pull, like every once in a while, I'll pull a leaf off of a tree just to feel it, just to have some kind of like texture to feel. And that's like something I've done since I was a kid, because it's just like it's one of my favorite little textures, basically, So it's something that I personally don't do a whole lot in my own work.
I was just about to ask that. I was just going to ask if you were ever tempted to synthetically imply, because you can't have texture in like a 2D digital realm or whatever, but you could imply texture. So I was curious because a lot of filmmakers, and I'm guilty of this myself, will overlay, film grain and stuff like that onto their video in order to imply that texture there, to try to fake it because it's cheaper. Going back to my opening statement. I'm curious to know from you though, like you kind of already answered it, but if you've ever been tempted to add like a canvas, like a texture overlay or whatever, because your art is pretty clean, and that goes. You did Garage Raja on paper. I do remember seeing you do
Garage Raja is pretty textured, actually.
Yeah,
like it's easy to be textured when you're doing pen and paper because the paper is always going to try and speak out.
Right.
There's a technique with traditional inking called what is it called? It's called dry brush. So basically the idea is when your brush is low on ink and you're still making lines with it, it's going to pick there's not as much ink that's going to be deposited on the paper, so you're going to get little bumps in the paper. So it's useful to use if you're doing effects for like smoke, or if you're using it for maybe you want to do a half grade between black and white. Those are usually some of the best opportunities that I've seen, that kind of use of texture, used in a comic illustration. It's weird because it's actually like trying to duplicate texture digitally, to me, is really difficult. I've seen a lot of artists who can do it, and I'm impressed by it because I don't really know what they're doing. I don't know how they're mimicking it. I know that there are different kinds of brushes that you can get that mimic different interactions between either brush and paper, or mimic different styles of brushes, different mediums, et cetera, et cetera. But even then, I still struggle to kind of mimic it in the way that other people can do super successfully. I still, every once in a while, I'll have some panels where I am doing that, but it's not like, it's usually because I'm messing around and I want to experiment and try something out, I've had panels where I'm definitely using texture to create an effect, an effect that would communicate what's happening is either something magical in a certain way or is breaking the reality in some particular way. I've definitely done that for transitions between our transitions into dream sequences. I'll use a kind of a watercolor effect, but not beyond that. I haven't really messed around with it a huge amount. So for you, it's using grain, but do you have any other things that you've used in the past?
Not when I'm doing film stuff. No, I've never thought to overlay any kind of other textures onto something. That's an interesting question because I'm just now starting to think about what would happen if I did do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But the problem is that there's already so much going on in filmmaking with editing and camera movement and things of that nature. You know what I mean? Like a blur is when you do a whip pan or something like that, or you tilt up too quick, or you dolly in, or anything like that. That kind of stuff is creating a texture that you're not necessarily cognizant of because your brain interprets the image, like the blur on the side. It's like, oh, okay, we're moving forward. Like they understand what that texture is saying. But like the idea of overlaying like a wood texture, it would have to be on a small scale and so almost imperceptible unless you freeze frame and then zoomed in and you were standing in a movie theater that you could pick up on it. You know what I'm saying? Like, cause, and then even then I feel like it would make people feel like they were on an acid trip. Like, even if they weren't, like if they weren't aware that it was there, it would fuck with them because on a subconscious level, I think they would pick it up, right? And they would just be like, something's off. And usually when something feels off, but you don't know what it is, that's when people dislike it. Like people will like texture if they are aware that it's there, and they can own it, like they understand it. But if it's not perceptible and it's there, they will be upset and angry, mostly because of frustration, because they're trying to figure out what's different and they can't get, you know what I mean?
And it might seem unintentional too. Like,
that's
and if it doesn't seem intentional, then it's like, oh, like what did they fuck up? Like,
well, yeah, and it comes across like we've talked about it before about, you know, lazy filmmaking, like, and that's the number one turnoff that I think a lot of audiences have is like, oh, they didn't care, so why should I? But yeah, no, a lot of that thing, that would be very experimental and trippy. I would have to play with that, and the problem with that is we always talk about, you know, your art becomes your babies, and I want everyone to like my kids. Like I want them to be the cool kid. I don't want it to be the, you know, the kid in the corner that's crying and feels left out and, you know, rejected, because then they're rejecting me. But it is an interesting thing to think about. Like if you, like I could see, I don't know what filmmaker would do something like that. It would really have to be like a out there experimental thing. Like I could see Banksy trying something like that if he made a film. I could see it, from like a mainstream point of view, the only person I could really see doing something like that is like Edgar Wright. Do you know what I mean? Like I could see him trying to look at texture or something like that. Maybe like if you the only filmmaker I can think of that really kind of digs in on texture would be Rob Zombie. Because if you subconsciously, not even thinking about it, if you've seen 2 or 3 Rob Zombie films, if I talk to you about Rob Zombie films, immediately you feel like you need to go take a shower. Like,
sure.
You know what I'm saying? Like it's got like a dingy, grungy feel to it. And no one's really saying, oh, there's like specks in it, blocked the camera and I couldn't see it and I did it. But there is a texture that kind of comes through the cinematography, the editing. Like there's probably an overlay there that we're not perceptive, like picking up on, but there is a texture there. And as soon as you think about it, like you hear Rob Zombie film, immediately you can kind of sense that texture, but you don't see it. It's weird. I can't. You look like you're biting your tongue. Is there any filmmakers you can think of that like have an implied texture that, you know, just are associated with?
I can't think of like specifically cinema, you know, like I can think of a lot of stuff from like Adult Swim shows, like Tim and Eric show. Like they do a ton of texture stuff to imply like a lot of the skits that they're shooting are like done on like video cassette. And that lends like, and it works for a lot of things where it lends like a certain amount of like, oh, like was this done in a closed cable kind of situation, you know, which adds credence to like the weird comedy. Like it would make sense to watch this maybe on like some closed cable television show at midnight. And that is like, to me, it's like, I don't know if that show would work otherwise, because you need that sense of like something's off from the very start. Like it's so off from the very start that it's like in the actual, or how you perceive the medium, right? When you perceive it as older and like maybe even more incompetently done, it's easier to like laugh at it or feel like it's for the purpose of humor. But I can't think of any filmmakers off the top of my head right now that have really applied it, you know? Like I said, this is stuff that I've seen in more like, for lack of a better word, like avant-garde or like newer or more amateur type creators, basically. So, and then like I said, beyond that, it's what it brings to my mind. Actually, that's kind of, I've been thinking about this a lot, which is maybe I've already talked about it on this show, but nevertheless, the music producer and musician Brian Eno had said this some time ago about the flaws and glitches in older media eventually become the foreground interests of like newer media.
Okay.
So like kind of going back to what we were talking about, right, with video cassette, like the video cassette, like I don't even know what you call that, when it's like I guess maybe the tapes are misaligned or whatever, and you see the little thing, like it's like a grid or electric grid run across the screen. I don't know what to call it, like the stripe or the strip.
You talking about like a digital representation of the audio?
Not the audio, but the visual. Like if you're watching like an older cassette, or like if you tape over something, if you tape over something, there's always like this one part where you can tell like it got taped over because there's this electric strip that goes across the screen for like a moment.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
That's something that gets so mimicked like nowadays because people want to mimic that effect because it does create a nostalgic like switch for people our age, particularly because we all grew up watching shit on VHSs, and I grew up like taping Dragon Ball Z episodes so I could rewatch them, weeks later. And so, that's become like an intentional thing now that's added to movies when people want to make that effect. Or like I was saying earlier, like lo-fi, like it's now an intentional thing. And I'm curious, to think about what will be the intentional textures of the future that are like glitches nowadays, right?
I mean, digital noise is one of those things that, already is, you can download a template that will add digital noise to something if it's too clean. So like it's already there.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, you literally everything is available to you. You could add like a setting, like a drag and drop template onto something and blow out the whites and the highlights, or, you know what I mean? Like you can fuck up your art intentionally however you want these days with like drag and drop settings. So I don't know what it would be. Literally,
the only thing I can think of
is just going to come around and fuck up your hard drive. Like I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's all I can think of is like stuff like algorithms and things like that, where it's like something goes screwy, right, in the presentation, or like you end up getting, referenced media or whatever that doesn't really match what you want, but you can kind of see the logic in it or whatever.
Yeah.
That would make sense in like video games, right? Like if you did a video game that was set if you did a virtual reality video game that was set in 2020, but like in 2030, right? So 10 years from now, maybe that will be the thing that like, becomes intentionally picked apart by future artists, because that's like, something that they were thinking about when they were, teenagers or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I guess going back to sort of the beginning, right, of what we were talking about. So, I mean, I think I like what you're saying in terms of texture as imperfections. And I think that's interesting because it kind of implies also that reality is imperfect, right? Like reality is like chaotic, it's unpredictable, it has like all these like little bumps and scratches and scars and all the little imperfections that come with just time and change and all that stuff. And that, I think part of why that also intrigues people, because it is so hard to mimic, because you have to think that through in a very intense and intentional way, right?
It's organized chaos. And it can't be too organized and it can't be too chaotic. Like there's a balance that falls into that. Like it has to be believable, but it also needs to be spontaneous. Like it's the biggest hypocrite of any art not perspective, art attribute. You know what I mean? Like there's a delicate balance of chaos and organization that's going into the texture. And if it's, you know what I mean? Like you want to feel the artist, but you don't want it to be so disconnected, but you want to be disconnected. Like it's hypocritical to its core. It's so weird, but we crave it. And that's the weirdest thing. Cause like you watch something like the Star Wars prequels and everybody always has the same argument. It's too clean. You know what I mean? It's to the point where it's like, somebody has come through with the fucking Windex every 30 seconds and wiped down these windows. And it's like, that would never happen. But then, you go in the other direction and it's like, oh, it's way too dirty. I couldn't see anything. Like people, you just can't fucking satisfy people sometimes. Yeah. But when it hits though, that's when it hits. It's a grand slam. Everybody's happy. It's like, oh, we found that balance. And I think that's really what it comes down to. For me, texture is always going to be important. It's something that I'm cognizantly trying to understand better in my medium, because filmmaking, it's, like we talked about the grain and this and that, but it affects color, it affects the lighting, it affects editing, oddly enough. You know what I mean? Like there's so many things that it ripples against, and it's one more thing that has to be balanced. And I don't think a lot of filmmakers take that into consideration when they're doing, they drag and drop like a fake film grain onto their thing or whatever. Like it has to work within balance. There has to be an organized chaos to it. And I'm currently, because I don't believe most people think about it like this, the way we've been talking for the last hour, I don't think there's a lot of thought that goes into it. And you know what I mean? It's just like, oh, put the film grain on it, done. Like they're not looking at it after the fact and going, oh, there's too much film grain, or the film grain's going in the wrong direction, or you know what I mean? Like all these things, it's an actor, it's a light, it's a sound effect, it's one of those things that has to be managed in a film process, and it has to be in service of the story and the characters and the overall atmosphere that you're going for, like the whole 9 yards. And people disregard it as just a thing. You know what like, oh, it's just, it's just part of it. Oh, there's nothing I can do to control it. Well, you can control it a little bit, and you should, because it goes back to your signature. Oh, Andrew looked into it and he found out film grain only goes in one direction. And so he realized that a lot of the drag and drop film grains, go in one direction, but not exactly the right direction. And that's why a lot of people pick up on it when you get a cheap one. And you know what I mean? It's going north instead of east. And like that kind of stuff matters. So at the moment, I'm kind of, ever since last week's podcast, I've been kind of researching. I haven't gotten into an answer yet, so don't get your expectations up. But I've been, trying to research the idea of how texture works within film. And it's very interesting that I can't find shit. So I'm currently, I feel like I'm at the forefront of a new discovery somehow. But that's exciting. And you know what I mean? Because if I can crack a secret, maybe I'll share it with people. But for a while, I'm going to definitely capitalize on that shit. And people are going to be like, wow, something's different and awesome about your shot design or your film or whatever like that. And so if I get to the forefront of this discovery, then people are going to be asking me, how'd you do that? Which is what they used to do when, I made Ghostface and Michael Myers disappear in my first little project by just doing a crossfade between a shot with them there and a shot with them not there and all that stuff. And they were amazed by it. But I feel like that's something I enjoy doing as an artist, is kind of, exploring things that maybe others overlook. Because I feel like it gives you an edge, which is oddly enough a texture in itself. But You know what I mean? But that, like, things like that make a difference, and that's what, as I think, what we as artists should be doing is trying to find those new frontiers, because everything, they feel like it's all been explored and it's all figured out. It hasn't. You know what I mean? Like, every day it's changing, and I think when I do whatever my next film is going to be, like, that texture is going to be something I'm going to pay attention to, because I think it does lend itself to atmosphere, which is the big thing that I'm humping at the moment, is atmosphere, and I feel like texture is a giant part of that. You know what I mean? How film grain affects like a fog rolling across the lawn, or even just the sweat or the blood on somebody's face. You know what I mean? Like, if you get into a close-up, like, it adds something to it, man. And it feels more lifelike and grounded, and allows an audience member to suspend their belief just a little bit more than they did before, and that's the high that I'm chasing.
Yeah, and it's, in older movies, it would almost be impossible for them to be able to do the special effects that they did without film grain, because it was the film grain that allowed things to kind of merge together in such a way that it wasn't so obviously like a guy in a suit or a matte painting, or like, I've watched a lot older films on like 4K TVs, and it's like, oh, that's rough.
Yeah,
like,
I've been doing the same thing, actually, and it absolutely does kind of ruin it a little bit. You would think that they would go in and maybe change some of that, like George Lucas, that shit, but
sure.
I don't know. Anyway, so we've talked about texture long enough. I will be shocked if anyone has made it through to the end of this episode. But this was fun. This is a topic that I think we can put to bed until at least I make some kind of life-changing discovery about texture and feel like I want to share it with y'all. So I guess I'll wrap it up. Next week, we are starting spooky season. Ooh. It's going to be a lot of horror film shit. Halloween type stuff. I have been waiting for this ever since we started this podcast. To be able to go full peacock and just spread the feathers of my horror-loving full bore. And now, Mr. Rainwater, you are not a giant horror guy, correct?
I want to get into it, but I have a hard time getting into I don't even know if most is the right word. I really like John Carpenter films, and that's kind of where it ends often for myself. And maybe I just need to dig in a little deeper.
Maybe we'll just do a Q&A where you ask me questions about what you should start with, what you like.
I like that idea.
That might be a good topic for us to do. But we're going to be talking about all things horror and Halloween, which I need to impart that there is a difference between Halloween and horror. Like, they always go hand in hand, but you can do Halloween without the horror sometimes. So that's going to be fun. We're going to talk about a lot of fun stuff, so stay tuned. Anyway, we will see you guys next week. Thanks for checking us out.